Hello friends, and welcome back to my channel. In today's video, I wanted to bring you a collection of trans book recommendations or trans books that we should all be reading. These are books that are either featuring trans main characters or written by trans authors. I really don't think I need to supply much of an explanation on why I want to share these titles with you. I just think that it is ultimately important to remember that trans and specifically Black trans women and people have been the backbone of this movement for generations. Black trans activists have paved the way for many of us. There would fully be no LGB without T included in that. There are so many rhetorics of hatred being painted everywhere right now, and I think that one of the strongest ways we can combat that is by forcing spaces for trans voices, and we can amplify them and uplift them, and that's going to be the biggest way that we can fight back from an individual standpoint. Now, if you are able and interested in, there are other ways that you can also donate and help lift these voices, such as the Trevor Project, which I will link down below. I know this is one that's very, very common, but I think it's common for a reason. They do wonderful work in uplifting young queer voices and an emphasis on educating others on transgender issues and transgender experiences. So I highly recommend you checking them out if you haven't done so before. I also want to bring up the fact that no queer person owes you their identity. It is up to them what they will share and what they won't. Like, you aren't entitled to any of that information. But to give a little context for this video, I do want to let you know that I do identify as queer and bisexual, but I do not identify as transgender. So if you are interested in any of these titles that I bring up, I have tried to do as much research on my own as I can, but you can always seek out recommendations by trans readers. I think that one of the biggest takeaways, though, I want to remind you is that you shouldn't go to trans people and expect them to freely teach you everything there is to be about being trans. Like, be willing to put in the work yourself and educate yourself without relying on information from others that are always getting these expectations thrust upon them. Those are kind of the big intro things I wanted to make sure that I include before I get into my recommendations, but I do have two other points that I want to discuss. One of which is that in my video, I am going to include non-binary authors and characters in my trans umbrella. Not all non-binary people are going to identify as trans, but in a lot of cases, trans has served as an umbrella term with non-binary within it. I'm not really doing this to open up any sort of debate. Any of the authors that I did include that I researched and found they were non-binary, I tried to make sure that they also identified as transgender to the best of my abilities. So I do have a list here of 15 trans recs to bring to you, but I do want to start this list off with acknowledging that it is Black History Month, and as Black trans people are so vital to the movement, I really wanted to highlight specifically trans Black authors first. The first books and author that I want to recommend to you is Akwaeke Emezi, and my favorite books of theirs that I've read are specifically You've Made a Fool of Death with Your Beauty and Pet. You Made a Fool of Death with Your Beauty is a wonderful contemporary romance that does explore gender identity and gender expectation, but I mostly am including it because it's just one of my favorites by Akwaeke, and they do identify as transgender. They have actually shared on their social medias pretty recently that they struggle with how often their gender is misunderstood and misrepresented, but I do find them to be a wonderful author, and I highly recommend you pick them up. The book in particular that I wanted to chat about is Pet. Now, this is their middle grade novel that does follow Jam, who is a trans child. It is such a stunningly written novel that focuses on a world where there are no more monsters. But what is a monster? What do you do when what you think you've been told your whole life maybe isn't as true as you thought? I think one of my favorite lines of the description of this book says, it confronts what do you do when the society you're living in is in denial. And I think that for being such a tiny little novel, it really packs a punch in messaging and theming. So if you've been hesitant or if you've read their other works and have not picked this up, please get to it. We read this one for a book club at my work, and I've been pushing this on everybody who loved it because they're so different, but their writing always is exceptional. The next recommendation I have is actually a memoir, and that is All Boys Aren't Blue by George M. Johnson. What I love most about this memoir is how beautifully it captures the joys of being queer and Black in America, as well as the tribulations of growing up queer and Black in America. From social interactions with other children to home interactions with important prominent figures such as their grandmother. Overall, I think this is just a phenomenal memoir, and the way it's able to discuss intersectionality in these various demographics and the ways in which socially they're not seen to overlap, but they may overlap more than you think. Now, this is a book that has often been on our banned book display because it is targeted usually toward a younger demographic. This is a memoir that's aimed toward teens, and I think for that reason you should read it, because don't let them tell you what you can and can't read. Now, some of the books that are on this list, I think I forgot to mention, I will not have read, but this is a list of ones that, like I said, we should all be reading, so they are on my radar. I do want to get to them. The next two that I'm going to bring up are nonfictions that focus on trans Black women who were prominent during the Stonewall riots. The first of which is Marsha, The Joy and Defiance of Marsha P. Johnson. This is written by Tourmaline, as well as Miss Major Speaks, Conversations with a Black Trans Revolutionary. And this is by Miss Major Griffin Gracie. Again, since I haven't read these both, I know it's not quite like I'm coming with a recommendation, but it is two novels that I see have very good reviews, and they are going to highlight key figures in the movement. So I think that in order to educate yourself on things that are happening now, it is really important to educate yourself on how they started. And these are two that I greatly look forward to getting to. So those were the ones that I just wanted to highlight that I am interested in or have already read by Black queer trans writers. I highly recommend you get to those and just acknowledge how much that demographic and that intersectionality has done for the queer movement. With that though, I'm going to use that to pivot to my next section, which is general nonfiction books. The first one I want to highlight and recommend goes along with that same idea of understanding where things began, and that is The Stonewall Reader. This is edited by the New York Public Library. It is a phenomenal collection of essays and accounts of the Stonewall riots and just different perspectives on key issues that were happening in that movement. It's much more of a historical account because you're getting glimpses from many different areas. It's less of a memoir, less of an emotional read, but I found it extremely eye-opening and educating. I just think that this is the perfect little book that most of us should have in our collection. I know I look forward to getting a copy and keeping it in my collection. I read this actually a while ago when I could not afford to get books, and it was just, it has stuck with me since I read it. That's how much it impacted me. So I highly recommend you pick this one up. The next recommendation I want to bring up for you then is Trans Like Me. This is by C.N. Lester. I find it really interesting because I picked this book up for a video concept quite a while ago, and I thought it was very impactful. Like, I had a great time with it. I learned a lot. And then when I was doing research for this video, I saw it on a great deal of lists recommended by trans people for trans people. So I think it has more of a cultural standing than I had quite realized, or a social, relevancy than I realized. But this is a really interesting novel where it's part memoir while also going into historical accounts, as well as being just overall very approachable for non-readers or readers alike that are maybe approaching a topic that they don't know much about, they're finding they identify with, but don't know where to start. Of everything on this list, I just wanted to point out that that was probably the novel that I saw recommended in the trans communities the most. The next two trans nonfiction novels I again have not gotten to, but I really look forward to doing so. The first of which is I'm Afraid of Men by Vivek Shraya. This is a memoir about Vivek as they are a trans artist, and they are exploring how masculinity has impacted them both when they were a child and through their transition, and how it has interacted in different ways with their life and for the worse in many cases as they've transitioned into their new identity. I look forward to picking this one up and really seeing how her journey evolves and seeing what I am learning about her journey while also seeing, you know, what experiences we have similar as women as she transitions into her new identity. The next one I really want to get to is Tomorrow Will Be Different, Love, Loss, and the Fight for Trans Equality. This is by Sarah McBride. What I'm looking forward to most about reading this novel is hopefully gaining a better understanding of more call to action type things that I can do to support my trans friends and family. I'm just kind of hoping that this will provide me with more thoughts and ideas of ways that I can help my community. Now in the same nonfiction vein, but going into graphic novels, I have two here, one that I've read and one that I have not. The first of which that I have to recommend for you is Fine, a comic about gender by Rhea Ewing. So this graphic novel follows Ray, who is the author and graphic designer who was exploring their own questioning of identity and what gender even means. And they decided that they wanted to interview like dozens of people to see what their take on gender is, both queer people, non-queer people. It covers interviews of people from a variety of different areas around the country. And what I found most interesting was how some perspectives on gender just were not sugar-coated. Like, some people had opinions that I myself would have found, I don't know, just not as progressive as I may have expected. But this just provided a different context on how differently we all view gender and how it's all just a social concept. Another graphic novel that I have not read yet, but I have here with me, and I plan on reading it before I return it, and that is Genderqueer. This is a memoir by Maya Kobabe. This is actually the deluxe edition, and it was a Stonewall Honor book. Now, according to the back of this novel, it does show that Maya uses neopronouns. Ear seems to be the primary one in the description. And I think what I'm just most intrigued to get to this one for is just of this list, I think this is by far the most popular queer nonfiction literature I've heard of in the last few years. I mean, All Boys Aren't Blue is definitely a close contender, but this one, for being another young adult graphic focused work, I'm just really intrigued by how it's done, and I look forward to getting to it. I'm sorry I don't have much to tell you about this one, but it's one that I do hope to read. I wanted to try and read it before this video and I couldn't, but I do plan on reading it very, very soon. I just have, again, only heard phenomenal things about it, so you should pick it up with me. So I'm going to kind of bring us into my next section with this last graphic novel recommendation, and that's going to be the importance of casual queerness. Not every queer story and trans story needs to be this huge coming out story. Like, there is a beauty to telling tales of trans love and trans joy and trans just existence. Like, they do exist. It doesn't always have to be this novel concept of them learning their identity. There is value in that, obviously, but there's also a wonderful value in giving them the space to have normal lives. So the next little graphic novel that I would have to recommend that's in this vein is On a Sunbeam by Tilly Walden. This follows a space exploration where they are basically trying to look into historical monuments, but in deep space. But there are two other storylines you're kind of getting and other hints at another plot happening where our main character is reflecting on a romance that they had when they were in boarding school, and you find out that this exploration is also a chance for them to search for that long lost love. This is another one that I have just heard amazing things about, and I love sci-fi. So anything with sci-fi and then you add elements of social consciousness, which is, you know, vital to sci-fi, I'm like, thank you. Then the next two sci-fis that I want to bring up do fall into that casual trans recommendation where both of the characters, these series are pretty similar and both of them follow non-binary trans main characters, but neither of the stories have to do with their coming out or their exploring their gender. They are just mediums for the greater story being told. For instance, the first one I have here is The Empress of Salt and Fortune by Neve, as well as A Psalm for the Wild Built by Becky Chambers. Again, I say these are very similar stories in the sense that they are kind of cozy, hope, fantasy, and then sci-fi. We're following non-binary main characters who are larger mediums for the bigger story. In An Empress of Salt and Fortune, we follow Chi, and they are a cleric that basically travel around and collects different stories. And then in A Psalm for a Wild Built, we follow sibling Dex, and they are exploring things about what they want to do with their life, but it's also a bigger picture where they are exploring what does it mean for humanity to find their paths, essentially. And these are just two beautiful little bundles of joy that I highly recommend you get to. This is a duology, so I do look forward to completing it eventually, but this is like a 5 or 6 book series at this point. I have enjoyed all of them, but I do highly recommend you physically read this and not just audiobook it, because the only ones I haven't liked were audiobooks, and their writing is beautiful, and I recommend you eyeball read it. So the last few books that I have here for you are some young adult trans recommendations that I have. The first of which is Ryan and Avery. This is by David Levithan. I am not always the biggest fan of David Levithan's writing, so I would at least take that with a grain of salt on whether or not you are a fan of his writing or not. But this story, I think, was very important to be told. I loved following our two main characters, and this is just a wonderful queer romance where one character is trans and one is cis, but they are obviously both queer, and it's their first 10 dates. I loved the kind of dichotomy of their families and how supportive and unsupportive the different sides were. I think this is also just a really great depiction of a realistic trans child's story. And if you are a fan of fancy writing, then you would love this. Lastly, I would recommend all of the books by Andrew Joseph White. For so far of what I've read, I have The Spirit Bears Its Teeth and Hell Followed With Us. Andrew Joseph White is queer and trans, and so writing about characters of that identity is very important to him. I'm getting that directly from his description. But he does this really great job of, honestly, so these are young adult books, but I truly believe that his writing almost surpasses the young adult genre in that it gets pretty, like, it pushes the boundaries, is what I'm trying to say, of young adult horror. The prose is gorgeous. The way that he was able to create such different senses of horror in these novels was bone-chilling. And I think in these, he did such a great job at addressing queer horror and trans horror while also just being a very captivating tale. I just would say that these are not really for the faint of heart. I don't know if it was just me being extra sensitive, but like this one in particular really freaked me out. With that though, that is all 15 of my recommendations or books that are on my own radar that I would like to get to. I know I didn't go into too much detail with each book, but I wanted to at least give you kind of a comprehensive list of different directions you can go with trans writing. There's nothing further I could really reiterate other than, my points from earlier. I will again have the Trevor Project linked down below if you're looking at getting more involved. With that though, I will go ahead and I will see you in my next one. Bye!